That song, Can't Wait Too Long, by the Beach Boys, which went unreleased back in 1967, sounds like an amalgam of their LPs Smile, Smiley Smile, and Wild Honey, all rolled up into one little track. 1967 was a pivotal year for the Beach Boys, but also a pretty chaotic one. One which saw the group make a radical change in their sound, record and then scrap a live album in Hawaii, and then try to re-record it in the studio, scrap that, start an album that many consider an R&B record. Folks, it's a mess. Well, here to help us straighten it all out and to talk about the Beach Boys' Wild Honey album, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, is editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, David Beard. David, let's set the scene for what was going on with the Beach Boys in 1967.
1967 is just a strange year for the Beach Boys in a number of ways, but it's really a tale, as you know, of, three different styles of music in one year.
Right.
And that's because the beginning of 67, January of 67, Brian was about three-quarters of the way through with his Smile material, 75%-ish, finished. And then at some point, nobody was really sure when, he puts the Smile album aside and suddenly has decided that, I don't know if we touched on this specifically before. Well, you and I and most listeners, when you hear Smiley Smile or Wild Honey, you definitely hear the lack of broad dynamic production that led up until those albums, and you think, how did they get to this minimalist recording? And I think the minimalist recording process and experimentation is really because Capitol was always insisting, and at this time they were in like a lawsuit with Capitol Records. They were pushing and pushing and pushing for more product. So what makes better sense than putting a studio in your house and just knocking off an album?
Right.
And that's what they did. And so that's Smiley Smile. And then with this kind of ongoing family-rooted thought process, let's get back to our roots, or let's get back to who we are.
And let's get back to being the band on the records.
Yeah. And let's not use the Wrecking Crew. We're now seasoned musicians. We've been doing this for 5 years. Let's go back and do an album like we did, on Shutdown Volume 2 or, the majority of All Summer Long, which is mostly them. So by August of, before Smiley Smile even comes out, you have the Beach Boys on August 25th they're in Honolulu, Hawaii, doing 2 shows. Bruce Johnston's not there. He left because, in quotes, it all got too weird. Brian goes, and he takes his Baldwin organ with him.
Of course.
And here they are doing these shows. And as a quick side note, these, as we mentioned in our previous interview, these are now available on the new Sunshine Tomorrow 2-disc set. So you can hear this for yourself. And they kind of do a minimalist approach to the live show. And they come back, and this is what's really interesting here. Nobody really can say, because they don't really remember, they do know that they decided to re-record most of their Hawaiian shows because they weren't satisfied with the result.
Right.
They're working on this Late in Hawaii album concept, and Bruce comes back, and they decide, okay, well, Bruce, we want to make you, since we're re-recording these songs, we can add you, and it'll make it sound better because we have another voice, and we'll go ahead and give you a song. So we're going to re-record the Beatles with a little help from my friends. Whoever decided that, I don't know, but they did it, and at some point, it was decided we're not doing Late in Hawaii. We're going to do a new studio album.
And while the Beach Boys had always recorded cover songs from their very first album, in fact, they had recorded 2 Beatles songs on the Party album, 1965, but Sgt. Pepper had only just come out not that long ago, and here they are in the studio doing a cover of With a Little Help from My Friends, and my guess is they probably just looked at each other and said, what the heck are we doing?
I think it probably, I agree. But let's not go too far down the hypothetical road.
Right.
But what we do know and stay with the fact, I agree with you. I think that's exactly what happened. Like, what the hell are we spending our time trying to fix a live album when we're sitting here in my house in the studio?
Right. Brian, you do music. Mike, you do words. How hard could it be? We've done this before.
And you know what, probably, while we're laughing at this briefly, I would just say they probably thought, why are we covering a Beatles song?
Yeah.
We're the Beach Boys.
What would you think if I said...
So it's nice. I mean, I'm glad we got a chance to hear it. But let's move into the album the Beach Boys decided to work on, the album called Wild Honey. And this record has a reputation, and has had it since it was first released 50 years ago, as the Beach Boys' R&B album. Why do you think that?
Well, I think it's Carl's vocals that make the album R&B.
Yeah.
I don't think, if you really listen to this music, I don't think as a whole it's R&B music.
No, it's peculiar, just like Smiley Smile for the most part.
But I think it's so much more than an R&B album. I think it does have an R&B feel to it.
Yeah, on like half the tracks, maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, Wild Honey, Darlin',
Sure.
I Was Made to Love Her.
Here Comes the Night.
Okay.
Let the Wind Blow and Country Air really there's no R&B.
No, I mean, it's R&B in a sense because it's, they do Stevie Wonder tune. But I think if you really listen to it, it's so much more than an R&B album. It's Bacharach, it's Motown, it's...
there's a little. There's even some country in there a little bit too. I mean, but here's the thing: you mentioned something, and I think we have, before we go into side one, track one, and talk about the tracks, we should mention again the Sunshine Tomorrow set, because that stereo mix of this album, in my mind, is a game changer. You're hearing things that you didn't hear before in the monitor.
Oh, you feel like you're holding the tambourine.
Yes, exactly.
It's like you've been invited over to Brian's house. It's 1967, and you're jamming or you're just hanging out with the Beach Boys while they record Wild Honey. That's how close it feels. That's how warm it feels. And that's how great that sound is now that they found that true stereo separation.
So let's begin with side one, track one, the title cut of the album. And this might be, with the exception of the Stevie Wonder cover, the most obvious R&B influence cut, and that's Wild Honey, featuring the screaming vocals of Carl Wilson there.
I think Carl was the right guy for the song. Brian was still, I'm not going to say calling the shots because that would be inaccurate. Brian was active, but I think the reason that Carl is so present on the Wild Honey album is because this is where Brian's kind of pulling away. Because Brian could have easily sang a lot of this stuff that Carl's singing.
Right.
But we do hear Brian singing on the album where the stuff is more personal.
You know what's great also about this cut is you've got the return of the theremin, which is a welcome return, and you've got that saturated organ break. Check this out. We'll be back to talk about the Beach Boys' 1967 album Wild Honey with our guest today, David Beard, right after this charming retromercial.
The largest record store in the known world.
WFDU FM.
That's us. We're back talking to David Beard, host of the Good Vibrations podcast, also the editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, as we go track by track now through the Beach Boys' 1967 album Wild Honey. You know, a lot of this album doesn't sound like it's geared towards what's happening in music in 1967. You know, I always feel like this album is very insular, like the Beach Boys are doing their own thing, and hey, if you're into it, great. If you're not, but they're not really out to jump on the hit parade, really, with this record.
Not at all, and I think that's why, if similar to Smiley Smile, those albums, 3 albums in a row, Smiley Smile, Wild Honey, and Friends, are very much insular albums. They are the Beach Boys doing albums for the Beach Boys.
Yeah, they're making music for each other.
Exactly, and that's what those 3 albums represent. Let's explore. Let's listen to who we are jamming together. Let's just, okay, here's the key. Here's the words, let's go.
And even with that mindset, they're doing incredible things, because track 2 on this record, Aren't You Glad, is one of those great undiscovered gems.
Yeah, and it's 3 songs in one, which is not unusual for a Beach Boys recording.
Right.
But, yeah, it really is something special. This song is kind of like some of the Smiley Smile material where it's, nice and soft and slow.
Right.
And then it's back up in your face.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what this is. But this song, if you ever wanted to hear the beat, because Brian did go on to do, never officially released, but he spent a lot of time on Walk On By. And, he was clearly influenced by Burt Bacharach, and a lot of that comes through in this song and this album.
We're up to track 3 on side 1 of the Beach Boys' Wild Honey album, and Carl Wilson up next on lead vocals, his version of Stevie Wonder's I Was Made to Love Her. It takes a lot of guts to cover a Stevie Wonder song and do it justice, but God bless him, Carl does an amazing job here.
He does a great job.
Yeah.
And then on the Sunshine Tomorrow collection that we've mentioned, there's an alternate version to the song that I think most people have heard by now.
Yeah.
It's longer, where they fade out and they come back in and Carl vamps. He was an R&B guy, always. For Carl to latch on to Stevie Wonder's sound was certainly natural. And the fact that Carl wanted this on the album and that Carl brought this to the table, I think that's another part of what makes this album distinctive. In the past, the covers they did were kind of probably Brian or Mike's idea.
Right.
In the case of Sloop John B., it was Al's idea. But clearly, this was Carl's choice. This was something Carl wanted. And as you say, because they did cover songs in the past, it just was like, well, sure, let's put it on there.
Next up, we've got a track that fits the mold of a quiet verse and then a boisterous chorus, and that's the song Country Air. Not really much of an R&B flavor here, but it's all part of this motif that the Beach Boys would return to time and time again of celebrating nature and, thinking about the environment. And it starts, I guess it starts on Smile, but it continues here on the Wild Honey album and later on.
And that's why I think it's important, if you listen to Wild Honey and get into Wild Honey, that you kind of treat Friends as a part of it. You could almost take one group of the songs and pull them away and say, here's your R&B stuff, and take the other handful of songs and push them to the other side and say, here's your things that deal with nature and life.
This next one, A Thing or Two, that's the name of the song. I don't know what category this would fit in. It sort of starts off like a Lovin' Spoonful cut, and then we get into a raucous chorus. Here's the interesting thing. We talked about, we just did side 1, 5 cuts, all very different. Wild Honey, Aren't You Glad, I Was Made to Love Her, Country Air, A Thing or Two. That's a heck of a journey to go on. And that, by the way, amounted to about 12 minutes.
Yeah.
Because all these songs are super short.
Yeah. Yeah, 12 minutes. And turn the album over and it's a shorter journey.
Yeah, it's even shorter. So we begin side 2 with a song that would be a single for the Beach Boys. It's also a rewrite of an earlier song, a song that Brian had written for, I believe it was Sharon Marie. Didn't she have the record of Thinking About You, Baby?
Yeah.
The verses from that. And I mean, Brian and Mike wrote it back in 1963 or 64, but what they did was they basically adapted those verses and wrote a killer chorus for it.
This is something that, I think initially Brian was working with Danny Hutton's group Redwood that, I don't know if it was his group per se, but with Redwood, who Danny Hutton was in, and then he went on to Three Dog Night, very short period right after this.
Right.
But this is one of the songs that was being considered for Redwood. When you can feel a person's soul in their voice, and I mean, that's what we get from Carl, and that's why I think there's such a direct relation to Carl's coming out on this album, because you can feel it. It doesn't matter that he did not write the song. You can feel his presence in the recording.
Then we get to track 2 on side 2, and here we go with Brian's humor. Now, this is an amazing song because, you hear it and you think to yourself, all right, this is a guy longing for a girl. I get the idea. I can relate to this. And then at the end, he throws in a twist ending, and you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, did he just say what I think he said? What exactly is going on here with this song?
This is kind of like a day in the life of a Beach Boy, or kind of almost like a Dennis storyline, or and just in a humorous way.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Again, it's very intriguing, but then it's over so quickly.
It's over before you know it. Just when you're getting into it, it's over.
Yeah.
I'm doing this.
Let's get to Here Comes the Night. It's an interesting song, just on its own, but also because the Beach Boys, for some reason, decided to revive this one in 1979 and turn it into a disco cut. Yeah, but here's the original.
Bruce Johnston decided to do that.
Well, now we've got Brian doing an R&B style vocal.
Yes. It's almost as though maybe because Carl just dialed into this R&B vibe. And remember, what you're hearing from Brian, and he oozes right through all the stuff, is you hear his humor, you hear his presence, you hear his mindset, you hear his heart, but you also hear the other Beach Boy. It's interesting. It's almost like, as much as Pet Sounds was kind of Brian's album with the Beach Boys singing, this album feels like, I'm not saying it is this, but it does feel like it's a Brian and Carl album with the Beach Boys.
You talk about Brian's mindset, and with track 4, for me, I wouldn't say it's the centerpiece of the album, but it's such a special song, and I feel like it's Brian making a dry run for Till I Die in a way. Let the Wind Blow.
Let the Wind Blow is a special song. It is a special recording. And Marilyn Wilson Rutherford does believe this song was written specifically for her and to her. One of the things I asked her, I said, I know this is subjective. I hope I'm not going too far off the reservation. You have a stained glass window that ends up as the album cover in your house. You were a member of the group, the Honeys. Wild Honey is obviously a song about a girl.
Right.
Darling about a girl. I'd Love Just Once to See You in the Nude. This is obviously, for the most part, a guy singing to a girl. And I said, I almost hear like this is a love letter from Brian to you. And she says, I don't know if that's certain, but she did say that Let the Wind Blow was for her. And you can hear it. Brian is just, you can hear his suffering in his voice.
We move on to a song that features a writing contribution from everybody but Brian, and Dennis didn't contribute to this, but it's Mike, Bruce, Al, and Carl coming up with How She Boogalooed It, which sounds to me like really a jam.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And How She Boogalooed It, to me, the last two cuts, How She Boogalooed It and Mama Says being a Smile Leftover remnant,
Right.
are just like, well, let's just put this number of tracks on the album and say, okay, this is 10 tracks now.
Right.
Not to say that, 11 tracks.
That's all right.
I mean, How She Boogalooed It's a whole 1 minute and 56 seconds. But I love it, man. I love Bruce hammering away on the keys and everything.
Yes.
I mean, that's wild. And you know that's Bruce.
Right.
It's so quirky and goofy, and it's really the Beach Boys kind of bringing the most silly element out of their personalities and doing it together and having a blast.
How would you sum up the Wild Honey album?
You really feel the presence of the songwriting team of Mike and Brian. It's really Brian and Carl vocally.
Right.
Mike's there, of course, but it feels very family, like a big family affair. Even with Bruce and Al, it feels like a family album, as does Friends. They feel like family albums, from the packaging to the listening experience.
And speaking of the packaging, we always talk about the covers of these albums, and this one has some controversy about it. There are a couple of different stories about how the album Wild Honey got its name and the image on the cover.
Right. The album cover is Brian's stained glass window, which Brian came up with, by the way. That was his, Marilyn said, oh, yeah, I kind of remember just going, yeah, that looks nice. that it was Brian who did it. He was the one who came up with it. He wanted the bee. He wanted the honey. So Mike comes up with the title, right? Well, I think anyone looking at the stained glass window could have come up with the title. And I guess they had some wild honey in the kitchen as well. Again, as other things we've discussed in the past, I don't think it's, one person's revising history and one person is not. I think everyone is telling the truth, and it actually marries together very well.
So during the course of this conversation, we've made reference to the Friends album, which came out the following year, and there are some similarities, as we've mentioned, between those two albums, but a difference, I suppose, would be how these albums were received in the U.S. and in the U.K. In the U.S., Wild Honey charted at number 24, which is not great. I get the feeling the Beach Boys really didn't care at this point. But in Great Britain, Wild Honey was number 7. So obviously in Great Britain, they were much more in tune with this record. Friends was like 126 or something. I mean, it really didn't do much at all in the U.S., and I think it was a top 20 album in Britain. So for some reason, the U.K. is really digging this stuff. And in America, well, I guess America is sort of perplexed.
Well, I don't know that they're perplexed. I think they're listening to other things by this point.
Yeah?
I think that's all it is.
Well, here's the thing. Brian, at this point, and it really begins with the Smile Project. No, actually, it begins with Pet Sounds in a way. He is the focal point of a gigantic commercial enterprise, but Brian is not concerned with commerce. And at beginning with Pet Sounds, really, Brian is operating as what would be called an indie artist. He is operating as an artist with a capital A. And whether or not the albums he puts out catch on with the public immediately or they don't catch on at all, it almost doesn't matter to him. He is so committed to following his muse that is the only thing that's important to him. And he knows that if he does that, he's not going to let anybody down.
And that's just the statement that you can apply to their biggest hits or the albums that didn't chart, or it doesn't matter what album or what song you're talking about. It's always been that way. Anything Brian's done, nobody else is doing. That's because only Brian can do it.
Right.
And some of it's with great results, some of it's not. But it doesn't matter to Brian. The music is Brian's muse.
David, we've run out of time, so before we go, tell us what's happening in the current issue of Endless Summer Quarterly.
Well, we just released our fall edition, and that is kind of 1967 eccentric. It's we have an article from Peter Luriam about the Leyden, Hawaii trip and the shows that we touched on, then a result of them not being released. But now, of course, they are on the Sunshine Tomorrow 2-disc set. And expect something later in the year.
We'll just let that sit there and germinate.
Well, yeah, just let that sit there.
Yeah.
And then there's a nice article from Ian Rustin about the Beach Boys as a touring unit in 1967, kind of from beginning to end.
Right.
Not the whole year, but key kind of components and quotes from Bruce in particular about the relationship of how he was fitting into the group at the time. It's pretty interesting, insightful. There's an article, a long interview with. I did an interview with Dean Torrance, who I had the pleasure of working with on the Filet of Soul album, and he wrote his notes for the Filet of Soul package. I wrote notes for the Filet of Soul package. But I wanted to present an interview that would kind of help the reader understand what Filet of Soul is and why it is what it is. Because when you think Jan and Dean, you think music, and you think, if you know their catalog very well, then you think, okay, maybe comedy, but certainly not an album, complete, on purpose sabotaged. So that's, if you're not ready for it, boy, you're going to be disappointed. But it's hysterical, and it's something that's never been fully released, and so it's cool that it's there. So that's one of the things that we get into, and then it's followed by one of my favorite albums. From recent, and by recent, I don't know what recent. I love music of all kinds. I'm a big Fleetwood Mac fan. I love the McVie Buckingham album. I love, Billy Joel, the Moody Blues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But one of the albums that's managed to stay with me for 20 years now is the Wilsons album that Carney and Wilson did which had Brian guesting on a number of tracks, Monday Without You, Everything I Need, Miracle, and then the girls did their cover version of Till I Die on that album. It's a very personal album. The music that's on that album, Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics is on that album. Mark Hudson and Carole King, co-wrote. I mean, it's a really special collection of songs, and Everything I Need was, Tony. The first time Tony Asher from Pet Sounds got back with Brian and wrote something new, and that debuted on that album. And that's the reason I went after that album. Let's go. Oh, Brian's back. He's writing with his Pet Sounds lyricist and everything. And then when I got the album and listened to it, I went, wow, there's some really deep personal things here coming from the girls.
Yeah, and as we mentioned last time, the winter edition will be covering much of the same ground we covered today. The Wild Honey album, although much more extensive in ESQ, as always, featuring interviews with, you mentioned Brian's first wife, Marilyn Wilson. I know you interviewed Brian recently, and people can hear that on the Good Vibrations podcast over on Mixcloud. Just look for Good Vibrations podcast. But how would someone, if they were interested in subscribing to Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, how exactly would they do it?
Well, the easiest place, I think, because most people these days are on Facebook, is to go to on your Facebook, just type in at the top Endless Summer Quarterly. That'll take you right to our page. And through that page, you can kind of see the latest issues that are coming out or that will be coming out. The magazine actually breathes fresh air into, subject matter that's 50 years old.
Yeah.
And that's always cool. The website is esquarterly.com.
All right, David, thanks so much. Always a pleasure, and we'll do it again real soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me on.